Welcome back to the deep dive. When we think about early Israel, especially from books like Joshua, our minds often jump straight to the really big dramatic stuff.
Absolutely. Things like the walls of Jericho tumbling down or Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, very powerful images.
Exactly. Cinematic moments, they show this absolute divine power and military success.
They definitely do. And they tend to dominate how we remember that whole period. But if we only focus on those spectacular events, we risk missing something quieter,
Yeah.
something more fundamental that was happening underneath.
Like the real foundation.
Precisely. The thing that, according to the analysis we're looking at, provided the ultimate justification for all that action. So our mission today is really to look beyond the battles, beyond the miracles, and uncover what was truly central for early Israel.
Which is this core idea of the covenant.
Yes, or as this specific analysis frames it, the absolute contract, this binding agreement that really defined their whole existence in Canaan.
And we're diving into this using some really specialized source material provided to us. It's an analysis that, frankly, challenges a lot of the surface level ways we might read these texts.
It pushes back on some common assumptions, definitely.
So the goal isn't just to recount history. It's more about exploring how this divine contract actually built the Israelite community, how it worked day to day, and maybe why understanding this ancient framework still matters for us, even with modern questions about value, wealth, community, things like that.
Exactly right. And it's crucial to see the bigger picture here. The entire Bible, Old and New Testaments, should be viewed, fundamentally, as a book of covenants. This contractual lens isn't optional for understanding it properly.
You mean if you miss that core contract idea?
Then the whole interpretive structure gets shaky. You end up with serious misunderstandings, theological problems, historical misreadings. It's that central.
Okay, let's dive in then. We can start with that huge pivot point in the book of Joshua. We just mentioned the sunstop event, this massive symbol of God's will backing Israel, achieving what the source calls absolute justification, like the undeniable right cause.
It's a peak moment of divine military support, yes.
So logically, you'd expect the next chapter to be, I don't know, the final mop-up operation, the glorious conclusion of the conquest.
That would make narrative sense, wouldn't it? But instead, the text takes this, well, really surprising turn. Right after that incredible climax, the book of Joshua dedicates a huge chunk of text.
How much are we talking?
We're talking chapters 13 all the way through 22, 9 full chapters,
9 chapters on what?
on the incredibly detailed, almost tedious process of distributing the land. Property lines, boundary markers, who gets which specific plot. It's like reading ancient deeds and zoning laws.
Wow. Okay, that is unexpected after a miracle like the sun standing still. Why devote so much sacred text to essentially administrative details?
That's the key question. It forces us to stop and think. What did land actually mean back then? We can't just project our modern ideas of property onto it.
Right, because for us, land is an asset, maybe an investment, but not usually survival itself.
Exactly. You have to immerse yourself in that world. In agrarian society around, say, 1400 BCE, land wasn't just property. It was life. It was the basis for dignity, for having a future, for sustaining your family. Without land, your existence was fundamentally insecure.
What were the options if you were landless? It sounds pretty dire.
Dire is the right word. You basically had two paths, neither of them good. The most obvious was becoming a slave, losing your freedom entirely.
Okay, that's clear. What was the other option?
And the other was becoming a tenant farmer or a sharecropper. And while you might technically be free, this life was often just brutal, grinding poverty.
Can you expand on that? The source material really emphasizes how crushing this tenant system was.
Yeah, think about the economics. These tenant farmers, they often had to pay something like half, 50% or even more of everything they grew just in rent to the landowner.
Half. Just for rent.
At least half, often. Imagine working an entire season, pouring everything you have into the land, and then you have to hand over half or more of your harvest.
What's left is barely anything.
Barely enough, maybe, to get seed for the next planting season. Forget about supporting a growing family or saving for emergencies or getting ahead in any way. It was a cycle of poverty that was almost impossible to escape.
So land wasn't just about wealth, it was literally life and death. Keep your family alive or face starvation, debt, maybe even slavery down the line.
Precisely. It was a fundamental economic reality, life and death.
Okay, so understanding that extreme importance of land suddenly makes those 9 chapters of distribution make a lot more sense. It's not just real estate records, it's about distributing life.
Yes. And crucially, it connects directly back to the covenant, the contract.
How so? How does the distribution itself enforce the contract?
This is where the analysis gets really insightful. The land was the physical, tangible proof of God's promise being fulfilled. But, and this is key, it wasn't an unconditional gift.
Ah, there were strings attached.
You could say that. The land was specifically given to those who kept the covenant, to those who actively worked to live out the spirit and the specific laws of that contract in their community life. The gift was tied to their faithfulness.
So being loyal to the covenant wasn't just some internal feeling, like a warm, fuzzy belief.
Not at all, according to this view. It was about concrete actions. It was the practical, day-to-day implementation of the covenant law.
Things like,
Well, think about the social justice laws protecting widows, orphans, immigrants. The command to love your neighbor. These weren't just nice ideas. They were binding terms of the contract that literally secured their physical existence on that land.
so the way they structured society, like how land was divided to prevent huge inequality, that was a direct expression of the covenant.
Absolutely. The spiritual ideals had to be reflected in the economic and social reality. If you fail to uphold the covenant law, especially towards the vulnerable in the community, the understanding was that you ultimately risked losing your claim to the land, which, as we've said, meant losing life itself.
Wow. Okay, that perspective really changes how you'd read everything. If the whole Bible is fundamentally this book of covenants, what are the biggest mistakes people make if they don't see that contractual framework?
Well, the immediate danger is that God's involvement starts to look arbitrary or even capricious. Why does God support Israel? Without the contract, the easy answer becomes, well, because they're the chosen people.
Implying a kind of ethnic favoritism.
Exactly. Which, this analysis argues, violates the whole principle of God's universal justice. Instead, the contractual view says God supports those who strive to fulfill the contract, those who actively work to live by its terms, difficult as they might be.
So divine help isn't just random luck or based on identity. It's tied to actions and commitment.
It's tied to adherence to the mutually agreed upon terms. Without that, God's help becomes this vague, almost meaningless idea based on feelings or wishful thinking, rather than being grounded in justice and law.
This brings us to faith itself. If it's tied to the contract, then faith isn't just passively believing something or not doubting. What's the active contractual definition here?
Yeah, the source material offers a really powerful two-part way of looking at faith, especially through figures like Joshua. It argues faith is not just intellectual agreement or simply the absence of skepticism.
Okay, so what is it?
First, it's described as a fervent aspiration, like a deep, intense, burning desire for the covenant law to be fully realized right here on earth.
A desire for the contract to succeed.
Yes. And second, crucially, it's combined with a dedicated commitment and the actual capacity, the skill, the strength, the will, the resources to make that aspiration happen with total effort.
Okay, capacity is a key word there. It's not just wanting it, it's being able to pursue it.
Right. Wanting isn't enough. You need the drive and the means.
So thinking back to Joshua and the sun standing still, he wasn't just like hoping really hard.
No. According to this view, he was demonstrating both parts. That intense yearning for the righteous cause, the contract, to prevail, and his proven capacity as a leader to act decisively and command the situation to make it possible. Faith becomes this dynamic act of will and capability.
That makes sense. It shifts faith from being just a state of mind to being an action, a commitment backed by ability.
Precisely. His power wasn't just in not doubting. The power was in the depth of his desire for the contract's success and his capacity to push for its fulfillment, even against the laws of nature.
What about the mustard seed analogy? You know, faith as small as a mustard seed moving mountains. How does that fit?
Well, the source suggests that if faith is only not doubting, the mustard seed idea doesn't make a lot of sense. How does a tiny bit of not doubting move a mountain?
Yeah, it seems disproportionate.
But if faith is this intense desire plus the capacity to act, then the tiny seed represents the focused kernel of that commitment, the absolute force of will and ability, even if it starts small. That focused power, that capacity, can reshape reality.
So the power isn't in the lack of doubt, but in the concentration of will and capacity, however small initially.
That's the interpretation offered, yes. It's about the focused energy of that commitment.
That's incredibly clarifying. Okay, let's pivot back slightly to the conquest itself. This idea of the covenant links directly to what the source calls the absolute justification. What exactly is that?
The absolute justification is basically the principle that ensures God is seen as impartial, as acting universally. It means God operates according to consistent, righteous principles of justice, not showing favoritism to one group over another just based on who they are.
Okay, universal justice. But here's the really tricky part. Many people read parts of Joshua and Deuteronomy as God literally commanding the Israelites to completely wipe out or expel all the Canaanites. How does that fit with universal justice? It sounds pretty partial.
That is the core tension, isn't it? And the source material argues very strongly that a command for total annihilation or expulsion would fundamentally contradict this principle of absolute justification.
Why?
Because if God ordered the mass slaughter of one group simply to give their land to another favored group, it would make God seem partial, unjust, maybe even arbitrary. It would violate the very idea of universal righteousness that the covenant itself is supposed to establish.
So this tension forces us to question that traditional total conquest narrative.
Yes, it compels a re-examination. We have to ask, did it really happen that way?
And what's the evidence against total conquest? Does the text itself offer clues?
Well, first, there's the simple historical reality that Israel did coexist with Canaanite populations. They weren't living in an empty land. But more pointedly, the evidence comes from the book right after Joshua, the book of Judges.
What does Judges say?
Judges explicitly states that God intentionally left certain Canaanite groups in the land. This wasn't presented as a failure on Israel's part.
God left them there on purpose.
Yeah.
Why?
According to Judges, it was to test Israel's commitment to the covenant, to see if they would remain faithful to Yahweh or be tempted by the surrounding Canaanite religions, like the worship of Baal and Asherah.
Okay, but for that test to even work,
Exactly. For that test to be meaningful, the Canaanites had to be there. You can't be tested by your neighbor's idolatry if you don't have any neighbors left. So the ongoing need for this test in Judges is strong proof of coexistence. They were living side by side.
and that connects back to the contract needing free will.
Yes.
Oh.
True faith, genuine adherence to the contract, it can't be forced. If Israel had simply wiped everyone out or forced conversions at sword point, that would violate the principle of freely chosen commitment that's central to the whole covenant relationship.
Okay, so if total conquest didn't happen, what did it mean when the text talks about achieving rest or peace in the land?
It likely didn't mean the peace of a graveyard after a genocide. Rest or peace probably referred to the end of large-scale organized resistance.
Meaning the main political or military threats were gone?
Precisely. The major Canaanite city-states or coalitions capable of waging coordinated war against Israel had collapsed. It was a state of political and military stabilization. Think about it. If Israel had tried genocide or mass enslavement, the remaining Canaanites would have fought desperately, maybe through guerrilla warfare. There would have been no rest.
Just constant simmering conflict.
Right. So the achievement of rest suggests the end of major organized opposition, allowing for a period of relative stability, not necessarily the elimination of all other people.
This brings us head on to those really difficult verses, though, because the text does talk about forced labor, and there are definitely commands, like with Jericho or Ai, about total destruction, the harem or ban. How do we handle those versus the trees if the overall forest is this universal covenant spirit?
This is where that interpretive principle becomes absolutely crucial. You must interpret the specific difficult verse, the tree, within the larger context of the entire covenant spirit and God's established character, the forest.
You can't just isolate the verse and take it literally on its own.
If you do that, especially with the harshest commands, you risk making God seem cruel, inconsistent, or fundamentally unjust, which contradicts the core message of absolute justification that God is righteous and impartial.
So a purely literal reading, taken out of context, can actually undermine the whole point.
It can. It's like that warning from Paul. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. If you cling only to the literal letter of a command like destroy everything, you kill the deeper spiritual meaning in the broader context. This is where many critics, understandably, get stuck. They focus only on these trees and conclude the God of the Old Testament is morally problematic.
Because they're missing the forest.
They're missing the forest. The overarching principle that God is the God of all people and acts according to universal righteous law, not tribal favoritism, leading to genocide.
Okay, so let's apply that forest principle. How do we reinterpret the verses about forced labor, for instance?
Thinking contractually, the source analysis opens up a possibility. What if some Canaanite groups, seeing how the Israelite community functioned under the covenant, maybe seeing its justice or stability, voluntarily chose to accept Yahweh and join the community?
Integration rather than just conquest.
Possibly. Since we established that true faith can't be coerced, maybe their integration was based on consent.
But then what about the labor part? The text says they were put to service.
Right. Instead of seeing that as chattel slavery or forced labor, which violates covenant principles of dignity and choice, maybe we should interpret it differently. Perhaps it refers to mutually agreed upon roles and responsibilities within the now expanded community.
Like civic duties?
Something like that. As new members benefiting from the community's structure and protection under the covenant law, they took on necessary roles contributing to infrastructure, administration, general upkeep. They became participants in the system, not merely subjects of it. This aligns better with the covenant spirit than forced enslavement.
That paints a much more complex picture. A multi-ethnic community, potentially forming through a mix of conflict and voluntary association, all under this covenant framework.
It suggests a more nuanced reality than the simple conquer and annihilate reading allows.
Let's shift gears now to another aspect of the contract highlighted in the source: longevity. We look at Moses living to 120, Joshua to 110, and we usually think,
Wow, what a blessing. What a reward for their faithfulness.
exactly. But the analysis here offers a very different, almost unsettling interpretation.
It does. It suggests their extraordinary lifespans weren't primarily a personal reward. They were, in a sense, a necessary burden, directly tied to keeping the covenant contract alive.
A burden. How is living a long life a burden, and why was it necessary?
The shocking implication is that they lived so long because there was no one else qualified to take over. There was no successor ready who had both that fervent desire for the covenant and the crucial capacity to actually lead and execute the contract at the same level.
Wait, so God kept them alive because the leadership pipeline failed, because they hadn't successfully trained their replacements.
That's the stark interpretation. God extended their lives for the precise duration needed to maintain the continuity of the covenant, because without them, the whole project might have collapsed.
That completely reframes longevity. It's not a peaceful retirement. It's an immense, maybe even painful responsibility.
Imagine the weight. Carrying the burden of an entire nation's spiritual, legal, and political well-being for over a century, not because you want to, but because you have to, because the contract's survival depends solely on you.
That's exhausting just to think about. And the text itself seems to support this idea of sustained duty, doesn't it? It mentions Moses specifically.
Yeah, that detail is incredibly important. It says his eyes weren't dim, his natural force wasn't abated.
Meaning he wasn't just biologically alive, he was still fully functional.
Exactly. It speaks directly to contractual capacity. God didn't just keep his heart beating. God maintained his ability to perform his duties effectively right until the very end. It wasn't about granting him a long, quiet life. It was about ensuring the contract had a capable executor.
He was kept at peak operational readiness, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. Until the moment he died, because there was no one else ready for the handoff.
This theme of capacity and responsibility, it links directly to how we think about our own lives, particularly around wealth. The source draws a sharp contrast between Moses and Joshua's sustained capacity and the parable of the foolish rich man.
Right. The man who builds bigger barns for all his wealth, only to be told tonight your soul will be demanded of you. Then whose will those things be?
How is that a contractual failure specifically? Isn't it just about greed?
The analysis suggests it's deeper than just greed. It's not saying accumulating wealth through hard work is inherently bad. The contractual failure, happens when wealth is gathered only for personal comfort, for self-indulgence, while neglecting the clear duties the covenant imposes towards the community, especially the poor and vulnerable.
So you could be incredibly successful by worldly standards, follow all the laws, but if your wealth only serves you.
You've failed the contract test. The warning is incredibly severe. A life lived, ignoring those fundamental community responsibilities, might be judged as ultimately worthless, even if it looks successful on the surface.
Worthless. That's strong. And it connects to the idea that life itself isn't guaranteed.
Yes. The idea that even the gift of daily life, like the daily bread we pray for, isn't an absolute entitlement.
You're suggesting life is conditional on fulfilling the contract for that day.
That's the radical implication here. Life is granted day by day with the implicit understanding that we will use that day to strive towards fulfilling our contractual obligations. When the rich fool hears, "Tonight your soul is required," it's like saying, you haven't used your life according to the terms. You've hoarded resources, ignored the community contract. Your continued existence serves no purpose under the covenant.
Wow. So people who just accumulate for themselves, ignoring the community, they're seen as,
The source uses stark language. They're viewed almost as useless things that should be discarded because they failed to demonstrate their value within the covenantal structure. They haven't earned their keep, contractually speaking.
that is a devastating perspective, and it throws Moses and Joshua into sharp relief again. They lived so long because they did earn their keep.
Every single day. Their longevity was proof of their ongoing demonstrated value through relentless service to the contract. They justified their continued existence through their capacity and commitment.
Their value was in their service to the contract, not their personal gain. Unlike the rich fool, whose wealth became instantly irrelevant when his life, his capacity to act, was revoked.
A stark contrast indeed.
Okay, let's look finally at Joshua's very last act. His farewell address, his final testament. What was his priority?
Above everything else, he prioritized renewing the covenant contract. He gathered all the leaders, everyone with influence, one last time before he died,
And his message?
urging them, pleading with them to reject the Canaanite idols completely and to obey the covenant law strictly, without compromise.
Why was this specific act so critical right at the end of his life?
You have to remember who he was talking to. This was the Canaan generation. They hadn't seen the Red Sea parting or stood at Mount Sinai. They grew up in the land, surrounded by Canaanite culture and religion. The temptations were constant and familiar.
So the contract wasn't based on their own lived experience of miracles. He had to make it real for them, urgent for them.
Exactly. It was a critical moment of generational transition, potentially moment of crisis. He had to bridge that gap. Just like Moses delivered Deuteronomy, that second law, as his final instruction, Joshua used the most powerful form of communication he could.
Which was?
His dying injunction, his final will and testament, essentially.
Why is a final will considered so powerful? Why frame this crucial renewal that way?
Think about it psychologically. Across cultures, across time, a person's last words, their deathbed requests, carry immense weight. They're seen as utterly sincere, stripped of pretense.
People feel deeply obligated to honor a final wish.
They do. The source even uses that old fable of the blue frog, the frog who always did the opposite of what his mother said.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
But even he, the pathologically rebellious child, ends up fulfilling his mother's dying wish, precisely because she cleverly asked him to do the opposite, knowing he'd finally obey her last command. It shows how deep that impulse runs.
So, by framing this as his final will, Joshua was using the most potent tool available to impress the absolute importance of the covenant on the next generation.
Yes. And think about the term we use for the Bible's main sections, the Old and New Testaments. The word testament itself means will or covenant. It suggests God is deliberately using this format, the final, urgent, deeply personal plea, to convey the critical importance, maybe even the sorrow and urgency behind the covenant relationship.
Like the prophet's warnings later on, they also carried that weight of a final, desperate plea.
Exactly. It's God deploying the most profound human communication tool to try and secure this foundational relationship.
This has been a really detailed exploration, shifting our focus quite dramatically, I think, from the big battles to the fine print of the contract.
And that's the core takeaway, really. The foundation of Israelite society, according to this analysis, wasn't just military might. It was about embedding the spirit of the covenant, the contract, into everything.
From how land was divided.
To how neighbors treated each other, to how wealth was viewed, to how leadership was judged. The contract was the absolute center, the pivot point for their entire existence.
In understanding that principle, it really does connect this ancient story to things we grapple with today. What makes a life valuable? How should wealth function? What holds a community together? It moves from just history to, well, practical ethics.
It forces you to look inward at daily fidelity to principles, rather than outward for dramatic signs.
Which leads us to that final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Joshua left this incredibly powerful, binding final will. He poured everything into securing the covenant for the next generation.
But boo, after that generation passed away, the ones who had known Joshua, who maybe remembered the elders who'd seen the miracles, after the leadership that carried that direct memory was gone, how well did the next generations actually uphold that difficult, demanding promise?
Given everything we know about human nature, the pull towards comfort, the ease of compromise, the challenges of history, how smooth sailing could it really have been for this community bound by such a demanding contract?
How long did that intense commitment last? That's a question worth pondering, digging into this subsequent history found in Judges and beyond.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.